Happy New Year, everybody. So, I know everyone's kind of worried about or maybe anticipating what Trump is going to do, what he says, how your portfolio is either in euphoria or it's completely fucked, depending on what Bloomberg headline pops up on the day. But I sort of wanted to bring things back to what I believe is a constant in terms of what's going to happen in the developed world and use Europe or continental Europe as sort of a foil to illustrate my opinion on financial repression, the practicality end of the euro, and what that sort of means for us as crypto investors or hopefully people who are going to buy some crypto, maybe hopefully after this talk. So I live in Asia most of the year. I've lived in Greater China for almost half my life. I live in Singapore, spent some time in Japan. And financial repression is a mainstay of most of the countries where I've spent almost half of my life. However, when you think about Western Europe and America, most people believe in sort of property rights and the individual, and the money that you have in the bank is yours, and you can do these sorts of things. And obviously, we've seen that as capital has flooded into the United States and Western Europe over the past sort of 20 or 30 years. But I think people are being a bit blind to what is happening underneath the surface. And I'm going to put out a bunch of quotes from European politicians, and I think you need to take them at their word. They're being honest. They're telling you in code how they're going to fuck your savings up. And so I'm going to read these things out because I think you need to internalize this. And Europe is a great place to talk about it because of the situation economically is quite dire, and the ideas of how the politicians want to solve it basically mean they have to print money, and they need to steal it from people who are saving it. So this is probably the one and only chart that displays how fucked Europe is, and this is just electricity prices. This comes from a presentation in the, I think, European Competitive Analysis. Draghi gave a speech about this earlier in this year. And as you can see here, the EU is almost like 3 times as expensive to essentially have electricity. And our whole global economy, our whole existence is just a derivative of energy. So if you have cheap energy, you have a better standard of living. And obviously, anyone who's seen sort of a Chinese electric vehicle or different types of US products can understand that if I have expensive electricity, I have a very poor economy. And Europe is patently pretty fucked. So going on this, let's listen to Super Mario Draghi. These are some quotes from his presentation to the European Council on Competitiveness. The first thing here, he talks about sort of the import-centric nature of the EU. There is no domestic technology. It all comes from abroad. Next, he sort of talks about the chart that I just talked about, energy prices, 2 to 3 times the US and China. Obviously, that's a no-go for how you're going to improve competitiveness across Europe. He laments the fact that there are very few European tech giants. You're either using Instagram or TikTok. Choose one, right? And at the end of the day, Europe can't defend itself. And obviously, certain members of the European elite are very worried about the Russian threat or whatever you want to call that. But just because you have a problem doesn't mean that means you're fucked for the rest of your life. If you have solutions that make sense, then you can improve your situation. However, in my opinion, Europe suffers from a mind virus. And the political elite believe that instead of using cheap hydrocarbons from Russia and cheap products from China, they need to align with the US, which has more expensive energy piped by boats and LNG terminals. I mean, I'm loving that because I'm long some nat gas companies in the US, but probably not the best for European nationals. And cheap products from China. And you see country after country putting up more trade barriers or talking about how they're going to limit the impact of cheap Chinese goods entering the European market. And I know this might rankle some of you in this room, but I'm maybe it's called climate change denier, or whatever you fucking want to call it. The renewable energy hoax, spending trillions of dollars on wind and solar is not the way to go. Drill, baby, drill, and nuclear if you want to reduce these energy prices. And for any of you who want to sort of broaden your horizon in terms of energy research, I recommend reading the free research by Gohring and Rosengweitz out of the United States. They put out some excellent research on commodity prices and how they think things are going to evolve, especially in Europe because they believe in sort of the renewable energy hoax. So, fine, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. What do the people who run this place think about Europe? And here's a quote from Draghi. Over time, decarbonization will help shift power generation towards secure, low-cost, and clean energy sources. So if trillions of dollars that we've already spent has led to 3 times the price of electricity, the answer isn't to change and go to nuclear or something else. The answer is to believe more in something that didn't work in the first place. That's what Draghi is telling you. Macron, from his speech at the Sorbonne in April of 2024, and quote, and so yes, the days of Europe buying its energy and fertilizers from Russia, outsourcing to China and relying on the US for security are over. So we know that they have a solution that has nothing to do with reality. It's believe harder in the things that got you into the situation that we're in today. So then how do we square the circle? How do you pay for a very progressive, inclusive welfare state, great benefits for citizens of Europe? How do you pay for all these things? You print money. We're all familiar with this. Christine Lagarde, here's a nice little GIF in the ECB. So if you can't actually solve the economic problems from a first principles basis, what do? You start printing money. And I'll go into a bit on the technicality of how I believe they're going to do that in the future, but this is the solution. It's always a solution. It's why I love crypto, because I know at the end of the day, the majority of global politicians do not want to solve problems. They want to print money and just hand wave. Okay, let's listen to some more Muppets. Miss Piggy and Kermit, Draghi and Macron. Europe needs to mobilize at least $750 billion to $800 billion a year to keep pace with competitors such as US and China. Okay, that makes sense. Need to invest more, need to upgrade infrastructure. Okay, but where the fuck is this money supposed to come from? Well, Macron said it perfectly. We need subsidies. And the kicker, we need to review the way Basel and solvency are applied. We cannot be the only economic region in the world to apply it. The Americans, who were the source of the 2008 to 2010 financial crisis, chose not to apply it. And the unspoken word is, well, if they're not going to do it, why should we do it too? Here is bye-bye Basel III. So it's over. If you don't remember, after the crisis, the regulators got together and they said, hey, wouldn't it be great if banks held more capital against all this stuff that they put on their balance sheets, which kind of makes sense. And they put up all these rules. We're starting to see the impact in terms of the bank's unwillingness to buy government debt because it impacts their capital solvency ratios. And banks still do need capital, as we saw, was it 2 years ago, 18 months ago, Credit Suisse bit the dust, and the Swiss taxpayers, alongside UBS, picked up the tab. So I believe that Basel III is quite sensible, requiring more capital on banks' balance sheets. However, the politicians need to take this capital and fund the government, and so we're going to see the complete eradication of Basel III. The United States will start with the supplemental leverage ratio. You're obviously already starting seeing Bloomberg headlines about how the big banks, aka Jamie Dimon, is saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could buy infinite amounts of treasury bills and help fund the Trump and Bessent incoming administration? So at the end of the day, the EU needs buyers of member country debts. And Macron said it best. Every year, our savings, accounting to around 300 billion euros a year, go to finance the Americans. Whether we look at treasury bills or capital risk, this is absurd. I'm also in favor of introducing European products and solutions so that our savings can be used to finance our country. And so if you take a look at MSCI World, something like 73% of the weighting is American stocks. What do most people do? They take their money, they save it, and then they buy Mag 7. If they want a fixed income security, they buy some corporate debt, they buy some US Treasury bonds, but they're not buying the stuff that the Europeans are producing. They're not buying Euro stocks. They're not buying French OATs or Bunds or European ECB, Corona bonds, all these sorts of things. And so if the Europeans are funding sort of American largesse and we need money here, we need $800 billion a year of investment, why should we allow capital to freely leave Europe and go to finance the Americans, even though they're supposedly their ally? And so the unspoken word is, well, we're just going to mandate that you can't actually access other markets. We're going to mandate that capital stays inside of Europe. If you have money in a fiduciary or a regulated institution, you'll have an acceptable list of things you can buy, and that won't be Facebook. It'll be, I don't even know what a European tech company is, one of those. So on a technical basis, no Basel III means infinite leverage. And so if banks don't have to pose equity capital against bonds that they buy, they can buy an infinite amount of them. And so going back to my days as an investment banker, my great education allowed me to make boxes and arrows to understand what's going on. And here's a very simple illustration of what could happen if the bank could hold infinite amounts of bonds. So France needs money, obviously. And so they go to SocGen and they say, hey, I've got these great OATs. Would you like to buy some? SocGen says, sure, let me go call the ECB first. I'll take this OAT, and at the end of the day, I'll repo it to you, and I'll get some euros, and I'll hand them to France. And so I believe this is sort of the very simplistic structure of how a bank can buy as much debt as the parliament wants to issue. They can go to the ECB, and they can finance it. And the best part about this is that the bonds don't show up in the ECB's balance sheet. So they get to lie to everyone and say they don't print money. It's the banking system that's printing the money, because everyone has gotten hip to the idea that a central bank just prints money, they hold bonds. Every week, everyone's looking at all these sort of disclosures. So let's hide all the money on the bank's balance sheet. Let's use the banks as the credit generation vehicles in this next phase of financial repression. So French government gets euros, SocGen gets a bond, ECB gets a repo. And so the ECB prints money to finance France and hides the bonds on bank balance sheets. So I think this is a broader trend globally that you're going to see different countries use their domestic banking system to print money as opposed to relying on the central bank. And the good part about that is that the banks are more beholden to domestically elected politicians than to the technocratic elite who run these central banks, like the ECB, the Fed, and whatnot. And so you're going to see a lot more sort of battles between the central bank, which is trying to maintain the limited shred of credibility that they have left after the multiple crises that they continue to sponsor, and the politicians who have promises to their electorate to essentially give them free goodies with no austerity. And the banks will be the conduits of this credit. And this is why, at least in my analysis, I'm more focused on how are banks upping their balance sheets to do these sort of lending versus what's going to go and happen on the central bank's balance sheet. So France, I think, is the epicenter for where sort of cracks could start to form in the euro. And so right now, Holy Roman Empress Lagarde runs the show because the ECB has more power than France or any other government. Why? Because the ECB is allowed under their charter, or if they just made this shit up, that they can just print some money and buy bonds. So if you behave, we buy your bonds. If you don't behave, then all of a sudden it starts to be about 3% debt to GDP, or what is it? That's your budget deficit, 60%. But what are all these numbers that no one applies to? But the ECB can pick and choose which bonds they buy. And so right now she has all the power. But obviously people are like, hey, I want more goodies. The politicians want to get elected, and so they're saying, yes, we're going to give you more goodies. And right now, France is sort of having a problem of trying to get a budget through. And all the French people want the things that they're used to, and the ECB is like, hey, we're in a bit of a confidence crisis. Would you please not, borrow so much money? And they're saying, well, actually, no. And so this is the fight right now. Who's going to win? Is it the ECB that can buy bonds and keep your bond yields small relative to the bund? Or is it the politicians who have to make good on the promises they made to their electorate? Now, right now, the ECB is winning, obviously. But if you take a look at France, for example, on the left, the right, and the center, everyone wants more power in the French government versus in Brussels or in Frankfurt. And essentially, what they can do is say, hey, if you're SocGen or BNP or some other French bank, you're mandated to buy the debt that I issue. You can't buy a bund or some other bond within the EU area. You can't buy the ECB bonds. You have to buy my bonds. And the second, the national government basically tells its banks that you cannot make good on sort of the communal efforts of the EU by buying everyone's bonds and just buying my bonds, that's effectively the end of the euro. Now, obviously, the euro as a currency might still exist, but you're now starting to see internal capital controls between the different countries. And if France gets away with this as one of the biggest debtors in Europe, you can bet that every other national government is going to do the same thing, because they all have made promises to their electorate in terms of what they're going to give them, and the only way to do it is to print money. They must use their banking system for nationalistic goals versus the goals of the center in Brussels. And we can start to see this stress in the spread between OAT and bonds. Obviously, the ECB can easily crush this spread by printing more money and buying OATs. And if Lagarde is not happy with the political situation in France, she can withhold that support and sort of allow the bond vigilantes to run wild and possibly bring down even more governments that Macron tries to put forward. I'm not sure where this spread is currently. I took this chart last week. So at the end of the day, if the politicians are able to run this game, who loses, right? If the central bank or the banking system directly finances the checks of the national government, that's the road to hyperinflation. You get prices that rise, inflation rises. Obviously, inflation affects the entire populace, very destabilizing. Bond yields are below domestic inflation, and you get financial repression. Savers can't leave the game, right? This is what it's all about. You are not allowed to buy better yielding debt abroad. You are not allowed to buy better companies abroad. And you certainly aren't allowed to buy gold and Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin's already out there, a testament to people in this room. So how do you sort of blunt the force, the boiling frog, the slow death of sort of property rights across the Western world? So if regulated pools of capital are investing in all these things that are not home biased, well, you just tell them what they can invest in, what's approved. The regulator determines that. Second thing is crypto must be stored on the exchange. Nonsense about travel rule and all this sort of stuff. If you have to register your non-custodial wallet, or at some point you're not allowed to even use a non-custodial wallet to hold your own crypto, that's not your crypto anymore. That is a regulated exchange's crypto, which essentially is the government's crypto. And another thing that is starting to gain traction is if you want to be MiCA regulated, regulated in the US, in the EU, you need to hold capital in EU banks, regardless of the type of stablecoin that you're issuing. Why? Because they want capital to stay inside of Europe. They don't want it going to finance, best in Trump's agenda. They want it to finance the politicians within the EU. So here are some other signs of what's going to happen. This is obviously the famous cabbage of Liz Truss. She lasted less than the cabbage because of a riot in the bond market. I think the gilt yields are even higher today than they were back when this happened about 18 months ago. This is from a report about sort of pension funds and what they're allowed to invest in the UK. Read this for effect. However, the government is concerned by the evidence that UK pension funds are investing significantly less in the domestic economy than overseas counterparts. Okay? You want better returns. The best returns are in the US. I'm not going to put money in the UK. I'm buying stuff in America, is essentially what they're saying. The review will therefore use its next stage to consider whether further interventions may be needed by the government to ensure that these reforms and the significant predicted growth in DC and LGPS fund assets over the coming years are benefiting UK growth, which basically means your capital is not yours. Your capital is mine being the politicians, to fund domestic agenda. And if you think that you're going to give money to the Americans or some other high growth market, then you have another thing coming. These capital controls will be very surreptitious and will happen and you won't even notice it. You just go online if you're a pension person and, oh shit, I can't buy that bond anymore. I can't buy that stock anymore because it's not approved. And this is in the United States. And essentially, Governor Abbott has sent a letter to the Texas authorities banning the investment in any funds that have any sort of ties to China, right? And so while the EU is concerned about all their money going to America, in America they're concerned about lots of money going to China to fund some of the high-tech, high-growth tech startups. And you're starting to see pushback from public funds saying, hey, why are you sending your money over to China? Send it over here and invest in the United States. And so my word to everyone is it's time to get out. Crypto is the answer. Get out while you can. They're coming for your savings because they're out of ideas. Instead of doing the things that are actually going to generate more growth, you just believe harder in shit that doesn't work. And so I was asked to give a bit of my own market prognosis in terms of the United States, because obviously the next few panels are focused on that. I've written many times about this over the past sort of 2 months. I think that there's way too much optimism in what Trump and co are able to pull off in the United States. It's very surprising to see some very seasoned market professionals believe all the hype, especially the Doge committee with Elon and co. He's not even a government employee because he doesn't want to sell all this stock and all this other shit. So we have a non-for-profit company which is going to somehow cut trillions of dollars from the US budget, and he's not even an official politician. I think that's, pure just hopium, really. And the other thing is whether Trump has essentially the lock on the Republican Party to actually do what he wants to do. They have a 1-seat majority in the House of Representatives and a 3-seat majority in the Senate. The first major test of Trump's ability to get the Republicans on board is this debt ceiling fiasco. Trump asked the prior Congress, sitting in December of last year, hey, we have this debt ceiling coming up. I need to be able to borrow money to make America great again. Can you guys sort of, pull a fast one on the Democrats, refuse to approve this budget so that I get this debt ceiling thing included now before I take office and I don't have to expend political capital getting this raised? You have a revolt inside the Republican Party, a small minority of politicians who like to puff their chests and talk about fiscal responsibility every time this ceiling comes up, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. So even before Trump starts, he can't even borrow any money. And this is a guy who loves borrowing money. This is the name of the game. He has to expend precious political capital in the short time that he has to really get things done to get this debt ceiling raised. And he can't even do that yet. So I find that extremely worrying. And then, just looking at the markets, I think we're on the cusp of a mini bond revolt. 10-year treasuries at 4.8%. Let's see what happens at 5%. Last time we had a 5% treasury, S&P was down 20%. Bitcoin was getting the stick as well. And then you had Yellen come out in October of 2023 with this whole activist treasury issuance, issuing a bunch more short-term bills versus coupons to draw more money out of the reverse repos. So that game's already been done. What will Trump and Bessent do to sort of avert sort of 5% yields or higher on 10-year treasuries? You're starting to see this narrative come out in the press of the rate on debt is greater than nominal GDP growth in the United States. And mathematically, when you're over 100% debt to GDP, that is the start of a death spiral. So I am not very constructive on any markets right now. At the fund, we are going more into cash and then staking it on Athena, earning nice fat yields. But we're not increasing crypto risk going into this part of the cycle. I think Trump has his work cut out for him. They're going to have to be a little bit more drastic. There are no cosmetic reforms available to them to really get the markets going because they have so many inbuilt problems in sort of the structure of the global economy. So that's all I have for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.